to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. In this hour, we're going to be speaking to James Wasserman about Solomon's Temple, ancient Israel, and secret societies. But don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And you can check out our 5 years worth of archives at www.justenergyradio.com, and you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep you informed of all of the programming that will be coming up here at Just Energy Radio. So let me tell you a little bit about James and get him on the air, because an hour is still not enough time, but we will make it work. Okay, James Wasserman has been a lifelong student of religion and spiritual development. In 1973, he began working at Samuel Weiser, the world's then largest bookstore and publishing company, specializing in esoteric literature. In 1977, he left to found Studio 31, which continues to offer full-service book production and graphic design services. And James, I'm just going to say this before I bring you on the air. We need to work on that bio because it has nothing to do with your books. Okay, but don't be laughing in the background because I'm going to unmute your mic right now. Hi, James.
Hi, Dr. Rita. Thank you so much for your advice.
Well, I'm reading it. I'm going, okay, well, what does that have anything to do with Solomon's Temple, or your other book was about Masonic Washington? And I'm like, Yeah, ain't working for me, babe. Okay.
All right. We'll have a look at it.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about Solomon's Temple, but to start, let's just start easy. Why did Solomon need to build a temple in the first place?
Well, as you remember from the story of Exodus, when Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, it was carried in an ark, the Ark of the Covenant, familiar to everyone who saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. And for 40 years they traveled through the desert, and that ark was held in a tent called the Tabernacle, and that tent traveled with the Jews and was erected every time they stopped and was dismantled every time, they continued on. And when they got to Israel, the Promised Land, the ark remained in the tent. And Solomon's father, King David, said one day, you know something, I'm living in this beautiful house, and the Ark of God, the Ark of the Covenant, is living in a tent. There's something unfair about that. And he wanted to build a temple for the Lord. But the Lord gave him the message through a prophet that he had shed too much blood, David had, in the wars of conquest to secure the state of Israel. So that God said to him, your son will be a man of peace and a man of wisdom, and he'll be the one to build my home. And so David spent, a good portion of his reign making the provisions for the temple, collecting, gold, silver, rocks, wood, and brass, everything else. And he also had the plans for the temple that were communicated to him. So at a certain point, as when he was quite elderly, he passed all of this along to his son Solomon, and Solomon spent 7 years building the temple to house the Ark of the Covenant.
So before we actually get deep into that temple, I want to talk to you a little bit about that tabernacle, because it has always fascinated me. The whole concept. I mean, why did they need to build this whole enclosure? I mean, when they traveled with the Ark of the Covenant, they just covered it with the blue cloth and took it around. Why couldn't they just leave it in the blue cloth? Why did they have to build this whole mobile complex for it?
Well, that's a really good question, and that touches on the central nature of my book. And what I try to do in the book is to define the concept of sacred space. In other words, when a person builds an altar, he or she is distinguishing sacred from profane, and that action creates an alternate state of consciousness in which one is allied with the divine presence, and one feels a certain sense of humility that, if you're standing there, cooking breakfast and washing dishes and hanging out and, arguing with your wife or husband and getting the kids off to school or whatever you're doing in your daily life, that is the definition of profane. When you pray, you're attempting to create a sacred space. When you meditate, the same thing. And that the Ark of the Covenant was the embodiment of the divine on earth. It was the pure incarnation of the Spirit. It was the Word made flesh. And in this case, it was the Ten Commandments were what was inside the Ark, and that was certainly inscribed by the hand of God. So that sense of the sacred was in the case of the tabernacle. There was this very nice little courtyard, and there was the temple. The tent itself had two different areas to it. One was more sacred than the other, where the ark itself was held in a plain room. The model that I show in the book is a full-scale model that was really built based on the very strict definitions that are given in the book of Exodus. And this wonderful group of people, archaeologists and biblical scholars, have built it in the Timnah Park in southern Israel. It's absolutely breathtaking, and you really get a sense going there of what this tent, what this tabernacle must have been. And it really is, aside from the courtyard, from the campground. So you can imagine these thousands of people traveling through the desert, with the campsites all spread in a certain defined order around the tabernacle, and only certain people allowed to approach different parts of the tabernacle. It really set a central importance for the concept of prayer.
Were people allowed inside the courtyard? I always was led to believe that you had to be one of the priests to actually step inside at all. So it doesn't seem to me like you could commune much if you're sitting outside.
Well, that's one of the weird aspects of this whole, concept of the priesthood. From what I can tell, and I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that the people were actually allowed to go into the courtyard. I don't think that they were allowed in the tabernacle itself. I think that the tabernacle was reserved for the Kohanim, which were they were like a subgroup of the tribe of Levi, and they were the priest caste of Israel, and even they could not go into the Holy of Holies, which was only open to the high priest, and the high priest was only allowed to go in there one day a year on Yom Kippur. So this was really a very sacred and reserved space one person, one day out of the year. Curiously enough, Moses was in regular communion in that space with the Lord, but he was the last one. When his brother Aaron took over the priesthood, it became this very ritualized and divided place. But I believe the people were allowed in the courtyard. I believe that what my understanding of the sacrificial laws was that they were actually allowed to kind of cut their sacrifices themselves and hand them to the priests, and then the priests were the ones who put them on the fire altar itself.
I mean, I just read that part of the Bible. I think that's one of my favorite parts, talking about the tabernacle. And God just seems totally OC to me. When he talks about the vestments that Aaron has to wear, and he has to wear the breastplate with this hat and these shoulder things, and it has to be, it's like, God. Oh, wait.
Well, I tried in my book not to comment too much on that stuff. Now, you're getting me into big trouble here, right? As you often do, I've noticed. But I think, you've got to look at what was going on in those times, I think. I mean, people were so kind of undisciplined and wild and crazy. You look at some of those laws of, the laws of kosher, like you're not allowed to eat roadkill. You can't bite into a living animal and just consume it. You need to kill it and take the blood out, and then you're allowed to cook it. I mean, it only makes you wonder what the people were actually doing who weren't following those laws, I think that they just invested the priesthood and the concept of worship and this concept of fear of the Lord. We're talking about for the non-initiate class. We're talking about for the people. They invested it with so much difficulty that I think they were trying to develop a sense of the importance of spirituality in, a very primitive culture. Now, I don't think that those laws personally, and this is where I say I'm going to get in trouble, I don't think that those laws really apply anymore to modern society. I think we've moved beyond those things. But, only so far. Only so far. There's always there has to be a separation between human and divine. There really does, because if we treat everything with the level of unconsciousness and disrespect that we're generally showing in our lives, it's not going to work. Prayer and meditation and ritual and divine communion will have absolutely no meaning. We need to separate those things, and that's, in my mind, what the story of the Bible is all about. It's kind of the primitive attempt to begin that process. With
what you were just saying, what it made me think of or wonder, it would be wonder, is what the other religions were like. What was it like, religiously? I don't even know what other word to use. Religiously, from an Egyptian perspective, did they have the same kind of prohibitions and ritual and, here's the Holy of Holy, and how did those kind of things play out? Was this a kind of standard model that other traditions followed at that time, or was this something new and compelling, because Moses did actually interact with God in the burning bush, and and God scared the crap out of everybody, and they're like, okay, we'll do what you want.
Right. Well, my understanding of Egyptian religion, and I have a lot of affinity to it, but my real understanding of it is that there was very little for the common Egyptian. In other words, there was a very carefully defined priesthood and a very carefully defined initiate class. And, originally it was, very intertwined with the concept of kingship. So there was like a union of political and sacred. And then over time, as, the death rites began to spread, to a wider segment of the population, the very wealthy, when it came to the coffin texts, or even the upper middle class when it came to the papyruses of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it became more democratized, so to speak. But among the Jews, aside from this, very, very, very stylized relationship that the Kohanim or the priesthood had, there was a much greater responsibility for each member of the community. And each person was called upon to take certain steps and to worship and obey certain laws. And it was very carefully spelled out what a, let's say, average Joe had to do or could do, and I think in that sense, Judaism opened the doors to a certain kind of even further democratization than we had seen in the upper middle classes of Egypt, let's say. Poor people, everyone. There were certain times of the year, like at Yom Kippur, everyone had to give a small offering to the temple, both to the tabernacle. Both the wealthy and the poorest person gave exactly the same amount. Everyone had a stake in the spiritual well-being of the community. And, I think that's a model we could learn something from today, even in the administration of our tax code.
That'll just get us off on yet another tangent.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm getting you in trouble.
Well, we just had politics in the first hour, so it's like, okay, we're not talking about politics. When they built the temple, when Solomon had the temple built, was it built the same kind of exactness that was required when they built the tabernacle?
Well, it was, but we don't know exactly what that was as carefully as the building of the tabernacle was described in advance in Exodus. We don't have that exact description preceding the building of the temple. After the temple was built, we're basically told what size it was and more or less what it looked like, and there's two slightly different versions in Chronicles and in Kings. But the bottom line for the temple was it's a smaller building than we generally think it was. It was like 60 by 90 feet or something. It wasn't some huge, edifice, but it was covered all in gold on the interior. And it must have just been breathtaking. But again, very few people were able to go in there because only the priests were able to enter the precincts of the actual temple itself.
So they could just hang around in the courtyard kind of area.
Yeah, well, the Mount Moriah, the sacred mountain, now the home of the Dome of the Rock, was the worship area for the entire community. And when Herod came along in 20 BC to rebuild the temple, the second temple, he made the entire top of the Temple Mount into a very kind of fancy, beautifully sculpted area of worship. But it was, it was not only worship. I mean, in Herod's time, there was also a sense of, kind of community gathering. That's why I think the courtyard was open to people, because this would be kind of around the city of Jerusalem was built around the mountain, the holy mountain, and then the actual assembly of the people took place on the mountain itself, and the actual prayers were inside the temple, done by the very few. Those people kind of appointed by God to minister to the spiritual welfare of the community. I think that's also what's changed today. I think that today we have more of a sense that each person is more responsible, for his or her own, spiritual development. I think we're less inclined to accept spiritual leaders than people were in those times.
Why do you think the land, Mount Moriah, and that area is so coveted? Do you think that there's anything going on where the temple is located, maybe some ethereal or vortex-type properties or anything? Because it seems like everybody is fighting over the same little piece of land.
Well, having been there, I can tell you it's a pretty vortex hardly describes it. It's a pretty powerful place, And according to the legend, the foundation stone of the world, what is now, within, the rock covered within the Dome of the Rock. I've got an incredible photograph of it in the book. That this was the first manifestation of three-dimensional form on Earth. It's like a spark of light shot out of the heavens and coalesced into a point, and that point grew into the rock that is the foundation stone of the world, the Even Shatia, that from which all of our world grew. From the mountains to the lakes to the fields to the oceans, and it all came from this one point. So that's at least the legend, and they say that this is where Abraham was to have sacrificed Isaac. Some people believe that it was the literal site of the Garden of Eden. Some people believe that Adam and Eve are buried beneath the Temple Mount. This was the place where Jesus taught, his disciples and the people. It's the place where he forgave the woman taken in sin, where he overturned the tables of the money changers. And 600 years later, it became the place where they say that Muhammad rode his steed up into the heavens, that he took a journey in the spirit from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascended into the heavens on his mythical horse. So this has been a really sacred space for, basically the entirety of Western culture. The Knights... Mm-hmm. Pardon me?
Go ahead. I was just agreeing.
Yeah, the Knights Templar believed that they were actually headquartered in the Temple of Solomon. They were actually mistaken, but that's what they believed, and they took that charge and that space very seriously. When I went there, I mentioned in the book, I've always had a problem with the idea of the the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. It always seems to me, like the whining wall. It's just I never, from a distance, I never understood how a people could invest so much symbolic importance in what I long considered to be a symbol of abject failure. a failure of have held the temple. But man, when I went there in person, it just knocked me out. It was very, very powerful. Those people were creating a storm of psychic energy and a powerful central focus of their aspirations.
But if you think about it, a big part of Judaism is regarding the sacrifice. And the only place that you could do the sacrifices was in the temple. And so
right.
with no temple, you're not fulfilling your obligations to God, period.
Absolutely, Dr. Rita. That's exactly what the problem is. And that was my biggest single concern through the writing of this book. I was completely baffled by that whole idea. And what did it mean? What does it mean to a people to have, the Jews had the Ark of the Covenant. They had something that was made directly by God. First they screwed it up. They screwed it up the first time, and Moses threw the tablets at them and broke them on the ground. But then God sort of forgave them enough to rewrite the message on the tablets a second time, and then it was put in. Those two tablets were put into the ark and carried around for some 400 years, and put in the temple and held, carefully by the people for 4 centuries, and then all of a sudden their sins and waywardness from the Lord caused them to lose it yet again. So what does it mean when you don't have the central symbol of the temple? And then, 600 years later, they lost even the temple itself for a second time. And now you go there and I don't know what to say, but it's a little depressing if you take Judaism seriously to see, the Dome of the Rock on that place that, was supposedly belonged to the Jews. What happened?
I know. It always makes me wonder what did happen. How did they end up losing the real estate?
Yeah.
It's like, did their deed run out or something? I don't know. But something that you talked about in your book, which I didn't realize, was that, there was Solomon's Temple, and then there was the Second Temple.
Right. And
see, I always thought that Herod built the Second Temple, but I'm gathering that that's not a true statement.
No, not quite. What Herod did was he restored the Second Temple. The first temple was built, I'm just going to give you off the top of my head, somewhere, I think the building was completed somewhere around 957 BC. And it stood until 585 BC. So it was around for about 400 years. Then there was a 70-year period after the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's Temple, took the Jews, carried them off to Babylon, and where they were in exile for 70 years. And then around 515 BC, the Persians had conquered the Babylonians and allowed them to travel back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, and that was called the Second Temple. That was Zerubbabel's temple, or the Second Temple. But the Second Temple did not have the Ark of the Covenant any longer. It had the Sacred Holy of Holies, but it did not have the Ark of the Covenant inside it. It was empty. Then that temple stood for about 600 years, but in 20 BC, Herod rebuilt it. Now, it's funny, he rebuilt it so thoroughly that he actually uprooted the foundation and laid a new foundation. So, in essence, you could almost say that Herod's temple was the third temple. But actually, but it's considered a major renovation of the second temple. And then that stood, that's where Jesus did his teaching. And that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D. So it's been a long time. It's been almost 2,000 years since there was a temple, that was a piece of real estate definitely owned by the Jews without, without a co-owner or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's change topics here. And I'm just going to speak from a Kabbalistic perspective, but in some of the more ancient traditions, you don't hear about this as much when you explore the Kabbalah in more modern times. But there is a whole tradition based on magic and secret rituals, and a lot of people tie that to Solomon and his temple. Do you know anything about that?
Well, all that I really know are the legends that were built around.
We like legends.
Pardon me?
We like legends.
I know. I'm saying the legends go all the way back. As far as I can tell, the earliest legends of Solomon's magical power go back to Josephus, who was writing, 2,000 years ago. And then following him, the Quran is just loaded with stories of Solomon and his magical abilities and alliances with the genie, and the fact that he built the Temple of Solomon with the help of spiritual forces, and then in the Middle Ages, book after book was circulated that were attributed to Solomon, magical grimoires and sigils and names and spiritual systems and spiritual practices that were all attributed to Solomon and Solomon's magic. So it's a pretty wild and rich field of exploration.
But not anything that has come down more scientifically or more in more trusted literature, I guess. Because I've heard stories like Solomon's Temple was built based on like sacred geometry and all kinds of stuff.
Right. Well, it would have. It really would have had to have been based on the importance that it held, but I'm not conversant enough with that to really, discuss it too thoroughly. Okay. It was very carefully measured, and the rules surrounding how it was built without the sound of hammers. Now, if you think about that, how could that happen? Supposedly the blocks that built the temple were so carefully fitted that they didn't even need masonry to hold them together. And how is that possible if you're assembling, the stones at quarries far enough away that the sound of the hammers wouldn't be heard on the Temple Mount itself? I mean, it's pretty impressive.
Actually, I'm flipping through some notes here on my desk because, oh man, of course, I can't find it. It's a good one, and all right, hold on. Of course, like when you go looking for it, it's totally not anywhere to find,
That's one of the laws.
Oh, I found it. So this was a keeper note. So this is coming from a book called Legends of the Jews by Ginsburg. And so he goes on to say the shamir was made at twilight on the sixth day of creation together with other extraordinary things. And he said the shamir may not be put in an iron vessel for safekeeping nor any metal vessel. It would burst such a receptacle asunder. And it was used to carve the stones in the breastplates when the shamir was passed over the lines, thus they were graven.
And the shamir, is that, I was told that there's a legend that says that very same process was used to split the rocks and to carve the rocks, and that it was a worm, and the worm would crawl in a certain direction and establish a straight line, and then the rock would actually split in two along that line by some kind of divine power.
Yeah, it goes on to say, the wonderful circumstances was that the friction wore no particles from the stone. The shamir was also used for hewing into shape the stones from which the temple was built. Ooh, right there. Because the law prohibited iron tools to be used for the work in the temple.
Right.
Oh, there you go. Right there. On my desk.
Unbelievable. The solution to the entire problem.
Yeah, we just need one of them shamirs,
Yeah. Does it tell us who owns the shamir or the real estate?
With the destruction of the temple, the shamir vanished. Oh, well, I guess we're not ever going to have one. So why do they say that there's a connection? I kind of asked this, but I'm going to ask more specifically. Why do they say that there's a connection between, the Freemasons and Solomon and Solomon's Temple?
Well, that's, that's fairly easy to, comprehend symbolically, because what's going on here is that the Freemasons are credited with actually building Solomon's Temple. In fact, Solomon is credited with being the first Grand Master of the Freemasons. Hiram Abiff was the skilled worker in metals and cloths and stone, gold, who was hired by Solomon from King Hiram of Tyre. And the three of them are said to be, the original founders of Freemasonry. Now, in some of the myths of Freemasonry, it's actually founded by Adam, who taught mankind to live in buildings as opposed to living in trees or in caves like animals. But most Freemasonic thought these days, at least, symbolic thought, places the origin of the craft in King Solomon, and the building of the Temple of Solomon as the very first structure of Freemasonry. And in the Masonic initiation rituals, the candidate is essentially brought in to Solomon's Temple and given access to his degrees, in that sacred symbolic space. So they've long been, all of the churches that the Freemasons built throughout Europe were in some way, shape, or form patterned on Solomon's Temple, in the sense that they were, all areas of sacred space and construction, in the name or for the glory of God.
But that puts I have two questions. That puts the origin of the Masons way further back in time than what contemporary people say is the Middle Ages.
Oh yeah, but that's that's based on it's based on the earliest manuscripts surviving from Freemasonry from the Middle Ages. But again, it's hard to know with these things. I mean, we're sitting here today talking about God carving tablets with the Ten Commandments, and we're talking about, Adam teaching people to live in buildings, and, we're trying to make we're doing symbolic thinking. We're acting as if the myths are true, and we're pursuing the wisdom that the myths contain. So to put Solomon as the founder of the Templars, I think, is a beautiful myth from which we can all learn, a great deal. Whether it's true or not, I mean, does Freemasonry date back to the 16th, 17th century? Does it date back to the 14th century, or does it date back, 3,000 years to the Temple of Solomon, or 5,000 years to the origin of the world? It's really hard to tell. We know for a fact that in somewhere around 1650, we know for sure that someone was made a Freemason who was not a worker in stone. That we have as a literal fact. So I don't know if we place the development of Freemasonry to Sir Elias Ashmole joining in 1646, or what did he join? He joined, and why did he join? Why would he feel that there was wisdom among a group of stone cutters? Maybe he too looked back to a mythological past in which the temples of the Lord were built by a specially consecrated group of craftsmen and geometricians and architects and people who sought to define God as a being centered on earth through construction, or at least housed or welcomed on earth. The same way that we build a home for God in our hearts. Perhaps we're able to build a home for God in three-dimensional reality, inside of a temple.
Mhm. But I mean, the idea of a priesthood or secret knowledge being passed down generation to generation does have a long-standing history in those cultures.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How would you know how to do the geometry that made sure the building wouldn't fall down? Unless you were taught. You weren't exactly going to college. You were sort of being taught on the job. What would happen if you traveled to another place? How would anybody know that you knew the correct method of construction? That secret wisdom which you had learned at the cost of great study and effort, over many years. Well, the answer is, that they wouldn't know unless they had a kind of signs or secrets, maybe words, maybe gestures that allowed people, the masters, to know that someone had actually been trained by one of their equals in a different country who perhaps spoke even a different language. Building is really complicated, as we've learned over so many millennia. Buildings really do fall down unless they're made correctly. And the wisdom of that would might be considered a secret.
Mhm. Well, I mean, think about like the pyramids or some of the other structures that are around the world that predated Solomon's Temple. I mean, they were done by master architects and master builders that had to know something. something more than we know now.
Well, that's for sure. And those very same people have been identified in other aspects of Masonic legend as the Masons who taught Solomon. So the symbol set is endless. It just keeps moving on and on and on through all the dimensions of consciousness, and allows for a free play of the imagination and the symbolic thinking. So it's but by all means, Freemasonry has been dated back to the Egyptian pyramids.
Cool. And weren't the Knights Templar associated with the Freemasons, or is that a more recent thing that people try to attach those two together?
Well, that's an interesting question. In terms of a piece of paper that says, on 1307, Bill was brought into the Templars, and in 1315 he started the Freemasons. No, we don't have that, but we sure do have a lot of evidence that points to a survival of the Knights Templar. When they were arrested in France in 1307, there were many other European Templars. There were Templars in England, for example. Those guys were not arrested. They were warned by the king. They knew what had happened to their French brothers, and they also knew that because the king, the rulers of each country were Catholic, that they would ultimately be ordered to be arrested by the king of the country that they lived in, even if the king liked them. So a lot of them just took off and traveled and went underground, and in the English Templars are said to have moved up to Scotland, where they were welcomed by Robert the Bruce, who had been excommunicated. So he was not under the authority of the Pope. And it's believed that the Templars, fought and helped him establish the independence of Scotland. And it's also known that the earliest examples that we have of Freemasonry appear to have come from Scotland. So were they fugitive Templars who started a new spiritual movement that was based on a couple of principles? One of the principles being that you believe in God, but you don't get to question the other person about exactly the specifics of the belief, that you welcome fugitives, that you provide comfort for brothers in need, that you have secret words and signs by which you can be recognized by others, perhaps other fugitives, perhaps speaking different languages. There's very much the sense that they were on the run, that myth in Masonry, and it just, it tends to lead people, including myself, to believe that the Masons are in fact derived from the Templars. But there's no proof.
Okay. So now I'm kind of, in my mind, trying to do these mental gymnastics and going, okay, so if the Masons derive from the Templars, then it's really the Templars that are associated with Solomon's Temple.
Well, the Templars...
Or did they just kind of like converge somewhere and become one group or something?
Well, the Templars believed that they were living in Solomon's Temple. I mean, they were called the Knights of the Temple of Solomon. They were assigned that. They were assigned what is, now the El Aqsa Mosque, actually what was then the El Aqsa Mosque, which they believed was Solomon's Temple. And they thought of themselves as the Knights of the Temple. And they engaged. What makes it interesting to me is that there was an unbelievable amount of castle construction going on in Israel, conducted by the Templar order. They were building fortresses. They were taking down certain areas of castles and rebuilding them, in a more coherent and better defensive manner. They learned secrets of defense against some of the sophisticated engineering practices of the Muslim armies that were undermining, the very foundations of the castles that they were defending. So they were in a a very architectural group of people, so to speak, during their entire 200 years in the Holy Land. So the idea to me that they passed along architectural secrets to the Freemasons or within the Freemasons is something that, is coherent, at least from my point of view.
Totally unrelated question. The Crusades happened in 1100, 1200 AD, or the first ones?
Right.
Is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
All right, wait. I got a question. I just wanted to clarify that piece. But wasn't the Temple of the Rock built by then? And didn't the Knights Templars get control of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount? And why didn't they just kick them out? No offense to any Muslims that might possibly be listening. And get it back.
Why didn't the Templars kick out the Muslims from Jerusalem?
Well, if they had built the temple there, the mosque there,
right,
or had it not been built yet?
No, the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was there, and the Dome of the Rock was there. What they did was they just knocked down the crescent that was on the top of the Al-Aqsa, on the Dome of the Rock, and put a big, giant golden cross up there. And if you look at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you can see there are some pictures in my book showing the Crusader architecture of the arches of the front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I mean, it's really wild, to see the Crusader influence in the buildings, because they did so much reconstruction wherever they went, and so much construction. So they literally took over the Muslim shrines, and they killed Muslims, pretty bloody fashion. However, in 1187, which is basically just under 100 years after they took over, Saladin came and conquered the Christians.
Right.
So he reestablished, the dominance of Islam in Jerusalem.
So they did have it for a while. Because we were talking about, the Jews lost it. Well, after the Romans got a hold of it, and they never really kind of got control over that territory again, and then the Muslims came in, and they got a hold of it, and I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, we're talking about the Knights Templar, and they were there, and they controlled Jerusalem for a while, but they lost it to Muslims. Duh. They
lost it to the Muslims. And you want to really get into a funny question is when the Jews took the state of Israel in 1948 and after, the 1967 war, why did they leave the Muslims in charge of the Temple Mount? They could have taken it themselves right then, because they achieved complete control of Jerusalem after the 1967 war. So it's just, this stuff gets so confusing. The politics of that region, it's just, it's enough to give you a headache.
I would have thought that after that war, being nice, that it would be a place that everybody could share.
Well, that's going to be, I believe, the ultimate resolution of this entire problem. When we actually take, the sons and daughters of Abraham, which are the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, and we can all kind of join hands and worship together in the monotheistic faith that has been given to us as our legacy, by our common ancestor. And right now, we've been squabbling for millennia. The Jews were at various times allied with either the Muslims against the Christians or the Christians against the Muslims, and the Muslims, have been all over the place, allied with the Christians against the Jews or the Jews against the Christians. It's really nutty. I mean, it would be a lot of fun one day if a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim could go onto the Temple Mount and just, be at peace with one another.
Well, I think that's a perfect ending to a great interview, James. But it's time to go.
I thank you so much again, Dr. Rita, for the opportunity to talk with you, and it's been a real pleasure.
All right, James, but I need to go before I run out of music time. So thank you, and I will talk to you again soon, okay?
You got it.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
That's James Wasserman. His book is The Temple of Solomon, From Ancient Israel to Secret Society. His webpage is jameswassermanbooks.com. Next week, we're going to be speaking with Robert Bruval about the Master Game and Anthony Sanchez about the true history of mankind, the Greys, the Anunnaki, and the Illuminati. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita.